This is really a wonderful opportunity, isn't it, to get together, the three of us. This is June McFee, and this is Kristen Congdon, and I'm Regina Degg, and we're here doing this at the University of Oregon in 1994, 11 years after you've retired from the University of Oregon, and June is the spotlight of this interview, and we're going to cover various aspects of your professional career and a lot more of that. You've given so much to the field. Many people probably know you for Preparation for Art, landmark textbook in art education, but you have been so influential over so many years working in the psychosocial aspects of art education, and you've influenced thousands of students, many more than you probably can remember or could keep in count.
It came about by a request from many members of the National Art Education Association, particularly the Women's Caucus, who felt that for those people, especially those women who hadn't had the opportunity to study with you, they knew your work and they knew your writing, and they had heard over and over again about people talking about June McFee, but they wondered about you as a person.
Yes.
And it became really important to us and to the Women's Caucus that we had some kind of way of communicating to all of these other people who haven't had that personal experience with you about who you are and what you have given all of us. And so that's a large part of what we hope to communicate here today.
And we thought we might start by going back a little bit into some of the earlier parts of your life. And maybe you just talk to us a little bit about the time before Stanford. And
yeah. Well, there was a lot of time before Stanford because I can't tell you exactly, but my son was 6 years old. I must have been 37 when I went to Stanford. But in thinking about doing this program and thinking about the things that I think shaped my direction, one thing is that I grew up on Puget Sound, and the wonderful climate and the sound of seabirds, the smell of the woods, and at that time it was not a crowded place like it is now. And I spent a great deal of time alone with my dog, and it was safe for a little girl to go wandering around, climb up and down bluffs and walk along the seashore and just enjoy it. I also felt that a love of the Pacific, because when you live in Puget Sound, big ships come in from all over the world.
Oh, yes.
And you have that sense of, you live on a portal to the world, particularly looking east. And I remember the time I finally got to Fremantle, Australia. I knew about Fremantle because I'd seen ships as a child that had come from Fremantle.
Wonderful.
So that marvelous environment and that openness to the rest of the world was a very important thing. And I think the natural environment probably played as big a factor as, because we spent all our summers at the beach. I had my first painting in a show when I was 12 at a state
In
fair.
Washington?
Yes, state fair.
And what was the painting? It was a painting
of a landscape.
A landscape.
Of woods in a little cottage in it. And I had a teacher, and his name was Guy Anderson, and anybody in the Northwest will know who Guy Anderson was. He's a very famous painting, and through him I was exposed to people like Kenneth Callahan and Mark Tobey as a child.
Wow.
And it was fabulous. The Seattle Art Museum was built, and I started exhibiting there when I was 18. So I had this early immersion in art with Northwest painters who were all deeply involved with the environment. So I think that is a big factor.
So your parents must have encouraged you quite a bit.
My mother
to be
particularly. This is funny. I wanted to be a musician, and my mother had perfect pitch, and she started me out on the violin. So I ended up being an artist because that was the safest way. And it's interesting as you look back on your life how little things like that sort of shift the direction. And I think as teachers we need to be aware. I think I learned from my experience a lot about teaching that a teacher's attitude or a parent's attitude can direct people so very much. And a very strong influence on my concern about the individual. It fits in here very well. And that is my experience in college with And yes, it was all while I was in college. Some after was a graduate student coming back, but at the University of Washington, where I finished my degree, Alexander Archipenko, the Ukrainian sculptor, was
Yes.
there for a summer. And we started out, there were a lot of still life materials, and he said, well, you know, set up something and get started so you could see what we were doing. And I set up and did a fairly competent still life. And he, a great man, came up behind me and said, don't ever paint like that again.
Oh.
Really?
And that was really being startling, you know, challenging to somebody.
Yes.
But it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because I never did paint like that again.
What did he mean?
Yes.
He spoke very little English, but he was challenging me to not go along with the crowd and do
I
the
see.
stereotype kind of
I
thing,
see.
and to reach deeply into what I had to say myself, and so I started off in a whole other direction.
And that was Archipenko?
Alexander Archipenko. And then he talked my parents into letting me go to Chicago and study with him the whole next winter in a small studio of about 8 or 9 students. And that was just monumental. I was just 19 maybe years old. I have always felt, and from my background, that the individual is extremely important. And I know when I taught in the community college, I was stressing composition and organization because I was very interested in that. But to help each person develop their own direction, but give them ways to experiment, to see how they could express their ideas, and for me not to influence their ideas. That started early. And then I did a master's degree at Central Washington College, and there was a fine art education department there. That was in the 1954, 55, 56, way back then. And Reno Randall and Frank Bach, who older people in art education will recognize as very good people in the field. And the last day I was at to get my master's degree, my advisor called me in and said, you want to go on for a doctorate? If you don't do it now, you never will. So I went home that night, told my husband I was going to get a doctorate.
And how did Mac respond to that?
Fine. I mean, he sold his business, and he had a partnership in a small business, and we started over again.
June, I would like to have you talk about your husband, Mac. And you were married for over 50 years, and the two of you spent so much time together doing so many things, and he was a great influence on you professionally. And as an anthropologist, he worked with you sometimes, and you with him. We'd like you to just talk about Mac in some ways that are comfortable for you.
Right.
We know that he died a year ago, and so this might be a little difficult, and there might even be a tear or two, but that's okay. We'd like to have you do that if that's comfortable.
Well, it's you know, just to reflect on him. He's one of the most gentle, kindly, wise individuals I've ever had a chance to know. And I mean, the great joy in my life was the quality of his being.
Yeah.
I did get to go and do field work with him on the Blackfoot Reservation.
Right.
And watching him do field work and interrogation with these wonderful Blackfeet people, and he helped me see their tremendous value. Mac had a very interesting sense of ego. He didn't think he was any better than anybody else. He also didn't think anybody else was any better than he was.
Yeah.
He had this wonderful balance.
Yes, I remember
to-
that about him.
Yeah, tremendous balance.
Yes.
And I learned a lot from watching him work with the Indians. And actually, he got into anthropology because I was taking anthropology.
Really?
I was taking it at Stanford, and I was taking courses in the anthropology department, and I would go home with my material, and he was in philosophy. It was through that material that I brought home that I was studying that he got interested in anthropology and got admitted to the Stanford PhD program after he got his BA and went through that. So we both had a deep interest in the field. And but I've had a profound experience since he's passed. I've started the work in getting into his papers, and it made me realize how much he treated me as an individual. He did not impose his ideas on me, and there were some things about culture that I wish he had, that I found in his lecture notes. But I can see that he had this strong sense of my development in my own way, and we read each other's papers, and we had an exceedingly wonderful marriage in terms of relationship, the confidence we had in each other and respect we had for each other, and it was more the quality of his the way he lived his life that influenced me most of all. I came from my mother was from the South, and we're very impetuous, volatile, lots of Irish blood flowing through our veins. And he was a Scotch Presbyterian, and, very low key and everything under control. And so our marriage was sort of built on what his generosity of spirit to other people.
June, I'm wondering if you would be willing to share with us your Christian Science beliefs, because I know that that's very much part of who you are, but most of us don't know very much about that part of you. It's always been something that's very personal and that you've kept to yourself.
Well, I always had a very strong sense of the separation of church and state, and I felt that I should never bring that into contact with students, particularly teaching in a state university. And so I was always very careful about that. Well, it is a very, very large subject, and I've been a student all my life. Those are the first things I learned to read. But in relation to teaching, that's where this sense of the value of the individual and the potential of the individual is so strongly ingrained into my thinking is from Christian Science. And then the opportunity as a child growing up and through the years of reading the Monitor, the Christian Science Monitor, was gave you a worldview from an early age, which I think is terribly important. Then, of course, it being a religion that was discovered and developed by a woman was exceedingly important. And then the really deep philosophical reasoning that Rossetti has about women's role. And I think the only thing that I would want to say publicly, because I wouldn't want to say something that was not correct or right, and people could find that out for themselves, but the whole concept of God as father, mother, which has been missing in religious history.
Yes.
And think of what would have happened if we'd had more of that sense.
Yes. And thank goodness lots of people are starting to
and
think
now
of
they're
it that way.
Yes, the feminist theology is doing a great deal with it right now.
And it's changing our whole perception of women and their
Right.
roles and their power and possibilities.
Yes, that's
and so
right.
you had that early on.
I had that early on,
Yes.
and I think that was exceedingly powerful effect in the way I treated most anything. Certainly the concepts of individual growth and opportunity, so you don't accept barriers for yourself.
Yes. One thing that is interesting to a lot of us is that you have been a wife, a mother, an aunt, a grandmother, a great-grandmother, and you've played all those roles as a woman, and yet you've been a professional woman all your life, and I think a lot of women would like to know how you saw those things all working together.
A major reason I was able to do those things was the quality of person that Mac was. But my experience and way of working in terms of what I was going to do, I never looked very much ahead. It always just sort of evolved day by day. And you took care of the situation as it was that day, and tried to meet the needs of your different roles at different times. And
what were some of the more difficult aspects of that? Do you recall?
Well, I know there were times when I felt like I was going off to a conference and I really should be home with my little boy. And
so everyone has those conflicts.
We
if you're a
all
mother.
have those kinds of conflicts. Or when I was studying hard and concentrating, you know, the times when you're spending 3 years writing a book.
Yes.
I think now that was hard on my family. I know it was hard on my family.
Sure.
And so they gave a great deal to that.
You probably won't remember this, but there was a time when I was your graduate student when I came in to see you, and I don't really remember what the circumstances were, what we were discussing, but you went to your notebook, your very large notebook of your publications, and took out that particular chapter and handed it to me and said to me that you thought I should read this, and that it might not be a chapter that you would give to all your students, particularly male students, but you thought it was an important one for your women students to read.
I better go read it again.
But I was so touched by that, and I will always remember that, because there was I think it was a way that you were sharing with me some of those kinds of experiences that you'd had that I would probably face, that all women face in academia.
That was the paper that was written when they started the Women's Caucus.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Judy Loeb, that's right.
Yes.
That's right. Just Feminist Collage was the first book that I ever read that helped me start to look at myself as a woman professional. And in fact, the Women's Caucus really caused a lot of that to sort of come to the surface for me. And I think a lot of us just had it sort of tucked away, and suddenly we were starting to realize that a lot of these feelings were okay, and that they were becoming validated, and they were actually feelings that needed to be acted upon or pursued. And so your chapter and Judy Loeb's book and the Women's Caucus of NAEA really had a big impact on my life. It really did. And the fact that you were the first awardee, the June King McFee Award of the Women's Caucus, and gosh,
Now we've had so many more.
How many?
And I think 14 or 15. And I think that is the thing I have enjoyed the most at the Women's Caucus. And I know as president, you probably too have emceed those awards. It's probably the most magical night of the conference for so many women.
That's right.
Because we validate ourselves through you by giving that award, I think. And it's just a time when we can say, again, you know, we can do it, and that we have this role model in you.
Well,
it's really a special time. And the room is always packed with all kinds of people.
Yes,
yes,
it's true.
yes, the range of kinds of people that have had that award is very satisfying. One of the things that follows with this, and I don't know whether either of you or both of you were at, there was a conference being held in Miami. No, it was in Florida. Maybe it was Miami. And it was a time when the Equal Rights Amendment had been defeated there or something. And
they wouldn't pass it,
and
right?
Yes, so we went to Ohio State, and
Yes.
Ken Morantz invited and all the women didn't go to the Florida conference.
And Regina was the president then.
Yeah.
You were the one that
She
did
led
it.
that. Yes.
I had to talk to a lot of leaders in art education, and they were all men. And they were asking me to reconsider and how we should really go to Atlanta. It was Atlanta, Georgia, that hadn't passed the ERA.
That's right.
And so we were going to boycott the Atlanta conference, and we had a number of people in the field trying to convince us to do otherwise. And we tried very hard to suggest another location.
Yes.
And of course they wouldn't do that, and there were logistical reasons for that and all, but it was a very powerful year for a lot of women in art education that were involved in the Women's Caucus. We felt so good about making that stand, and I think we gained a lot of respect from the organization as a result of that too.
Because we did
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
That's what always impressed me and pleased me about being a student at Oregon, one of your students, was that it seemed like a student had such great freedom to go off in many different directions and study many different areas, but then they were to bring them back to art education in some kind of cohesive, meaningful whole. And that's the kind of support that you've always given so many doctoral students.
And I got that at Stanford.
At Stanford.
If that program hadn't been that way at that time, and I hadn't had some perfectly wonderful people to work with in all those areas.
And then you became a professor at Stanford.
Well, I was assistant professor there for 4 or 5 years. I can't remember exactly.
And who were some of your first students, your early students?
Well, there was Ron Silverman and Guy Hubbard and Mary Rouse, Arthur Eflin at Ohio State, Warren Anderson from University of Arizona. I'm forgetting a lot of them. That's a long ways back.
In the early 60s.
This was in the very early 60s. I left Stanford in 61, so I wasn't there very long, but there were 13 people got their degrees either while I was there or they were into their dissertations when I left.
That was a very important time in your career, going to the Penn State seminar and studying the direction. You want to tell us about that?
Well, I had, when my husband got a job and at Arizona, I was hired to go with him, but when I got there, because of nepotism, they wouldn't let me teach. So I spent 3 years just sort of at that first peak of my career.
Not able
to, but I did a lot of teaching around the country, different universities for 2 or 3 week periods and things like that. So and then preparing for the Penn State seminar, which really is a milestone in art education history, because the people who planned it did such a beautiful job of picking a top person in each of the social, behavioral, and philosophical and aesthetic foundations that was teamed up with an art educator who gave a parallel paper. And it got us, I think it provided the foundation the field as a whole needed.
To me, the Penn State Conference was also important in really beginning to focus on research in art education and the ways in which research was being thought about. And it seemed to me that you had some influence on that and actually gave a paper there that talked about your ways of thinking about research in the field. And
that was more the social foundations that I was working on at that time. I've gone through quite a few transitions. My first interest was in individual differences, which is exceedingly important. Still is, but it has not been as responded to, I think, in the field generally as it once was. Then the 60s happened, and the social implications were so very vital to everybody. But the 60s, we weren't nearly as aware as we are now of cultural diversity, because it is what the figure is, but it's probably 10 times more complex than it was then.
Also a period of time when some of the first doctoral students, I guess, had come to the University of Oregon. You had started the program, and what year did you begin the doctoral program?
Well, we started, Jessie Lovano-Kerr, now Kerr, Jessie Lovano, came with me, and she was teaching in Cleveland, and we arrived here together because the president and the dean had promised me, that was one of my criteria, if I came, I could start a doctoral program.
Yes. And so then there were Gordon Kensler, Vincent Lanier, yourself, Tom Ballinger,
Jane
Gehring,
and Jack Bergner.
Jack Bergner, right. And
it, you know, that was an awful lot to ask an department to do.
To start a doctoral program.
To start a doctoral program, or to bring
Sure.
new people in when they'd had a program that had been going on for a long time.
Yes. Some of the other people that came into the program in the late 60s included Ron McGregor and Graham Chalmers. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how you worked with students at that particular time and how your relationship grew, because one of the really important things about your career, in addition to your contributions to the field through your writings and lectures, is how you've mentored students over the many years, and the real strong affection that people have for you still today. And I think it began back there with Jesse and with Jim Smith and with Ron and Graham and a few others.
I've just had always such a strong conviction about the importance of the individual and the potential for individual growth that's there with everybody. So well, I think if you look down the list of students that have come through the program, they're exceedingly diverse in terms of each one's program was individually developed, although there was a core of basic courses that everybody had to take.
Yes.
I mean, I think we as a group have expanded the range of that subject.
Of what art education is, the definition, I think,
I don't know
has
if you
exploded.
remember, but back, I remember doing this with groups of students many times, and they'd say, well, somebody new would come in, they'd say, well, what is art education? And I would answer, it's what we make it.
Oh, which is a wonderful answer.
Right. Yes.
Well, and I think a lot of making it has taken place.
You allowed us to see it as something much broader and not just something that happened in the classroom.
Yeah. Of course, Graham Chalmers has stayed in the cultural area very strongly, and he's really a world leader along with Regina in that area now.
Yes.
But Martin Rail is at Wisconsin.
Yes,
And
state art supervisor.
State art supervisor, so that has moved off very much. And Ron McGregor has sort of taken the role of a senior, wise man.
I think that's well said.
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
he looks at things that have gone on and puts them in a very broad philosophical perspective and
With a tweak of humor.
oh, wonderful tweak of humor about it, right? Yes, right. And and there's a picture of dear Gordon Kensler, and he was such a contribution. He had very fine research skills. Well, then take, for instance, Linda Ettinger's work, which has gone off in such different directions.
Yes.
And computer design and information design. I've just been reading an article that Bev Jones has given me that she's really taking off from some of the points that I was working in 30 years ago in the original perception delineation material, and it's very exciting to see that happening.
Right.
One of the areas that I felt sort of that I was trying to break some barriers, and it was a very persistent thing I was trying to overcome, was the concept of age-based development in art, not taking into consideration all the environmental things, the whole Lowenfeld tradition.
Right.
And that reminds me of an experience that I had way back. I can't put a date on it. It was in the late 50s. I went to a national convention in New York, and I met a young man named Ken Beidel.
Oh,
and we got started talking and just had a ball because it was so we had so much to talk about. And I'd just finished my dissertation. And he took it to his professor, which was Victor Lowenfeld. And he had it overnight, and then I had a visit with him the next morning. And he was very encouraging.
Oh.
Now, of course, Victor was the one who was the grandfather and godfather of child development on an age-based continuum. But he told me, he says, we really know so little yet about the subject.
For you, the students always were people who should participate in the creation or the decisions that are made in communities, the decisions that are made in culture and in politics, and it can all stem from art. And you never saw art or art education as a hierarchical, top-down kind of thing.
And then, of course, still with Wadsworth, Regina and I had the contract to write Art, Culture, and Environment.
Yes.
Would you talk about that a little bit? I wonder how the collaboration went. I mean, having studied with both of you, how did you put it all together? Did you each have separate expertise?
Yes,
I'm sure you did.
Yes, we did. We did.
But the thing that I think people need to know of Regina's contribution is she was so aware of the current art scene, and she pulled together much of the artwork that is in the book. So she had also the practical application. I did the theoretical and the research, and she did the practical. But she really, the look of the book is 90% Regina. It was a wonderful experience.
It was, and it was wonderful for me. The notion and concept of working together with another person was so fortunate for me to learn that so early in my professional career, how you can collaborate. And that concept of collaboration is something that I hadn't really experienced at all, but June was so generous.
Oh, well, that was, I mean, the book is ours. It's not my book with Regina helping in any sense of the word.
Yeah.
It's, we did it together.
Well, that collaborative spirit is something that I think was always there at Oregon with the doctoral students.
June, you have really produced a lot of work. Much of it's been published, but I think that people may not know that there's a tremendous amount of material that hasn't been published, or data from various studies that you've done in the past. There's a lot of material here at the University of Oregon archived and available for people. I guess I want people to know that, because I think there are probably people that would like to pick up on some of this material, and it's available, and that there are doctoral studies ready to happen with data that has been partially looked at, or your own work that could be looked at over a long period of time. But I also wanted to know what you were thinking about these materials that are here now, and whether you think about going back to some of it yourself and actually working with it, and how you feel about leaving some of that and going away from it instead of just packing it away.
Well, this is something, of course, that every person who retires has to deal with, and the library here has most of my major lectures up until I left in '83, but I'm hoping while I'm here to get over there to talk to them about getting them copies of the lectures I've given since I retired. We need design as part of everybody's education.
Absolutely.
And cultural sensitivity and awareness. So to me, art education is a very broad field that reaches across all those disciplines. The awareness that art is a basic language system, and we're in a complex society, that we need to understand each other's culture and each other's art.
And all of these children are going to be citizens who are going to make determinations about their cities and their environments, and they need to have a sensitivity as to how to make the best decisions.
Yes, we need to develop instruments that would help teachers identify what is it that have meaning to kids, so they can have some idea about where to focus the range of kinds of things that students might do in the classroom.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things you wrote was that every child is a cultural mosaic. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, when you take any one child, very few of us are pure one culture person. Often our parents were different cultures. We've lived in different cultures. We're, as women, going through the culture change of finding out we're real people and have dignity and intelligence. And even though all of us have been professional people, women as a whole haven't learned that, and even we are learning it. I am, at my years of being around, am still having to learn